for doing this with us, Dr. Klein. We're very excited to ask you a few questions.
My pleasure.
So if we could just start with you giving us a general overview of your career trajectory and how you got here, that'd be great.
Yeah, happy to do that. So I had an interesting experience. I got to college and I was really interested in mathematics. I knew that, but I didn't know much else in terms of where I wanted to go. And I kind of lucked into a program, this is at Northwestern University, that integrated mathematics and the social sciences. So we talked about things like game theory and Poisson distributions and making predictions about the economy and so on. And you had to double major in a social science to be in this program. And many of my colleagues in the program majored in economics, which made sense. But I was interested in doing something else. So I took a psychology class. I really loved it. And so I ended up double majoring in psychology. And over time, I came to realize there was so much about mathematics that overlapped with interest in psychology. And that's what got me interested in decision-making and risk perception and risk communication. So I went off to graduate school in social psychology, and my dissertation was on how people construe risk and how that influences their decision-making. And also, because it's a social psychology program I was in, we looked at some of the social psychological reasons why people tend to underestimate their risk and why they tend to be biased. And so I ended up starting a career that kind of integrated social psychology and decision science with an application towards risk perception and health behavior. And that's what I ended up doing throughout my career. And I know it doesn't happen often that people figure out what they want to do in college. I have two daughters actually going off to college, and I've told them, you know, they can change their major, change their minds. There's nothing wrong with that. But I did kind of figure that out pretty quickly. That's what I was excited about. And so I ended up being a faculty member doing research in the area. And then now I'm at the National Cancer Institute, still interested in some of the same things.
Yeah, that's great that you've had such a, seems like a clear path from where you were to where you are now. Can you talk a little bit about how you transitioned to being at NIH and what your role there is like now?
Yeah, I will tell you, when I went to graduate school, I was at Princeton, and the faculty there, many of them have been there their entire careers or the better part of their careers. So my perception, I think, was, okay, this is what you do. You get a graduate degree and then you go somewhere and you stay there for 30 or 40 years. And Princeton's a pretty nice place to stay. So I can understand why they did that. So that's what I did. I left, and my first job was at Colby College up in Maine. And I enjoyed the position. In fact, I was there for 11 years. But things do come about, things change. And both for family reasons and also professional reasons, I found it was time just to be in a place where I could have graduate students and work in a lab and have access to more populations to do my research. So we ended up moving from Maine, and I took a job at the University of Pittsburgh, where I was for 7 years. And I planned on staying there for a long time, really enjoyed it. They have a really great program in social and health psychology. And so I enjoyed my collaborations, grad students, et cetera. But then NCI came along and they were interested in bringing in a behavioral scientist who had experience applying behavioral science to cancer outcomes. And Bob Croyle is the division director of our division at NCI, and he was very persuasive and convinced me to come to NCI. This is back in 2009, and I've been here ever since. So it's been a lot of fun. It's a great place to work. We have a mission focus in the sense that we're working towards reducing the burden of cancer, morbidity, and mortality. And that's different than being in academia, where really it's about building your lab and making a name for yourself and carving out a particular area of science. I enjoy doing that and would enjoy going back and doing that. But it also is fun to be doing things at the national level and having an impact on the science at the national level.
Yeah, were there any skills that you had to learn that you maybe didn't need before you were at NIH?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I will say I was trained as a traditional academic. So my happiest days were sitting in front of a computer with SPSS, which now has been supplanted by other programs. But I'd sit in front of my computer doing SPSS, doing lots of analyses. I enjoyed working on manuscripts, enjoyed doing research, also enjoyed teaching, and I still do. But that was my daily life. And then suddenly when I started taking on administrative roles, being a department chair, for example, and then now the role that I'm in now, that was a big sea change because now you have to think about completely different things when you're in a position like that. You need to pay attention to what's going on around you and what people's needs are and what their motivations are. And leadership is not as obvious as it might look from the outside, at least good leadership. And so it's taken some time to kind of figure out my own leadership style and persona. I've tried things that haven't worked, and I've tried other things that have worked. And it's a constant it's a constant learning experience to figure out how to be a good leader and how to move things in a way that is productive. And so I'd say that's been a big challenge, but it's been a challenge in a good way, not something that I've disliked, but something that's really pushed me to my limits.
That's great. And I know a lot of our members are trainees who are interested in possibly going to NCI or maybe thinking about a career path like that versus going into more traditional academia. So do you think that for people who are still early career starting out, are they primed to kind of go in these positions without having this kind of culture of traditional academia beforehand? Are there things they should focus on if they're more interested in going this route?
Yeah, well, we have a lot of fellows who come through our program and our division, and they've all been trained in traditional academic settings for the most part. Some of them have come from cancer centers where they've done work on cancer, but most of the time they haven't necessarily had a great deal of exposure to cancer. And so it's not as if they're not prepared. It's just that they come to a place where cancer is now the main topic, and there's a little bit of a learning curve there. Much of what we do, though, is relevant to other diseases. So if you're interested in obesity or tobacco control, tobacco cessation, sun exposure, these are behaviors that are related to different health outcomes. And so it's not like you're entering the cancer world and can never get out and do something else if you wanted to. We pride ourselves on training our fellows well so that they can go off and get a lot of different kinds of positions, academic, government, industry, et cetera. I think probably the most important thing coming into a fellowship opportunity or a training opportunity at NCI is just being open-minded and understanding the value of reading journals outside of one's area of expertise and working with people in different disciplines and recognizing that there are different ways of doing things and that your training isn't the only way of approaching a research question. I'll give you a very specific example. I'm trained as a social psychologist, and in social psychology, we talk often about how you should never do median splits. You should never get rid of data. You should always treat scales as continuous if they're measured as continuous variables. And yet in epidemiology and in other areas like public health, often data will be collapsed into categories, and then you compute odds ratios. And odds ratios are reported rather than beta coefficients. Well, that's a huge change, a big difference. And I have found in collaborating with people in epidemiology, we've had to figure out, okay, which is the right way to go? And it turns out it's often dependent on the research question and what you're trying to accomplish. But that's one maybe trivial example of what I mean. If you come to the table and recognize that different disciplines do things different ways, even with the same research questions, that really will help you a great deal.
Great. And for people who are specifically interested in decision science, what opportunities for that do you see emerging in the next few years in terms of funding, research, anything like that?
Yeah, well, I encourage decision scientists to apply for funding from NCI and NIH more generally. I have to say, one thing that people don't often realize is that most of the projects that we fund at NIH are investigator initiated. They're not in response to a particular funding announcement on a particular topic. And decision scientists are doing so much work that's relevant to health outcomes that matter at NIH. Obviously, lots of different kinds of health behaviors, physical activity, smoking, seatbelt use, sexual behavior. There are all kinds of things that decision science can contribute to. And on top of that, decision scientists often are trained in a way to take advantage of different kinds of data sets and integrate the work that they do with other areas. Decision science is more of an interdisciplinary science, I think, than some sciences are. And so by their very nature, people in decision science are well equipped to put together interdisciplinary teams to tackle major questions that are important to NIH. So that's something to think about. But there are sometimes particular funding announcements that are of relevance to decision scientists. One of them that we have at NCI is one that focuses specifically on affective and decision science. My colleague Becky Ferrer is the program director on that one. And we have funded several grants that explicitly apply research on affective science and decision science to risk behaviors relevant to cancer. So every once in a while, we have those kinds of opportunities, and people in decision science should be looking for those.
Great. And you mentioned collaborations and interdisciplinary work, either from your own experience or as somebody who oversees these kinds of things. How do you recommend that people, particularly in their early career, establish collaborations with clinicians or other researchers in different fields?
Yeah, I think it's a very important thing to do and not an easy thing to do. When you're in graduate school, you're just trying to figure out which classes you have to take to graduate and figure out what your next topic is going to be for a project, master's thesis, or dissertation. So it's a tall order to ask graduate students to be thinking about, okay, how should I establish my interdisciplinary nature? I think it's easier to do in a postdoc and easier to do as a junior faculty member. But during all of those phases, it's good to just keep one's eyes open and seek out opportunities and meet people in other areas. I think there are some ways to do that. One is to go to brown bags, go to lectures in other departments and see what people are doing. We often delete those kinds of things, those announcements, in our inbox because there's so many different things we can do. But I think it's a good thing to go to lectures, presentations, brown bags, discussions that take place outside of one's own department and outside of one's own discipline, because you can often meet some interesting people who potentially could be collaborators down the line. Another way is to attend other conferences that one typically does not attend. As a social psychologist, I would almost always attend social personality psychology conferences, CESP, SPSP, and it's a good thing to do those. But as I started to do more work in health, I started to attend more health conferences like the Society of Behavioral Medicine and ASPO, the American Society of Preventive Oncology. And doing that exposes you to other ways of thinking, other work being done, but also, perhaps most importantly, you run into people in the hallways and at the poster sessions and at the social events, and it gives you an opportunity to find out who's in the field, what kind of opportunities there might be. And it's often where postdocs get set up and job interviews are scheduled and so on. So the networking piece, even though that can be overhyped sometimes, is a very important aspect of getting connected and being interdisciplinary.
Great. And do you have any other general advice for trainees or early career researchers while we're talking about it?
Yeah, I would say probably the most important thing is to take risks, within reason. When you're trying to establish a portfolio for tenure, then taking risks is maybe not the best thing. But it still is worth trying new things, trying new approaches, integrating new methodologies, new analytical approaches from other disciplines into your own work. That's a good thing to do because it stretches the field and it's novel. And hopefully once one does have tenure, if you're on a tenure track position, hopefully that provides some flexibility to take even more risks and do some more interesting things. But I think it is important to try new things and not be afraid of that. I remember reading work by Tom Gilovich, of course, revered in decision science, where he talked about how regret tends to vary over the lifespan. And he talked about how people are more likely to regret the things they've done when they're younger, but as they get older, they begin to regret the things they haven't done. And I think there's something to that. And if you know that that's going to happen, you can offset it by taking more risks and trying new things now so that you don't regret not having done so when you retire and get to the later stages of your life.
That's great advice. Is there any other advice you've received from your own mentors or any other papers you've read that has really stuck with you?
Yeah, well, I think the open-mindedness, as I said before, is very important. Being able to kind of stretch yourself and not reify barriers between disciplines. I think that's something I've definitely learned. And one of my favorite mentors is Neil Weinstein. And one thing I loved about his work and his approach is that he tried very hard not to be biased and to see support in his hypotheses that perhaps wasn't there. He was more of a cynic and a skeptic of his own work than anyone else's because he wanted to make sure he got it right. And I think having that kind of scientific integrity and lack of bias is important. It's impossible to get rid of bias completely. We know that from legions of research in psychology and elsewhere. But to the extent that you can work to offset the effects of that bias and really be objective in the way you evaluate your work, you just end up doing better work and make more of a contribution to the science. So I think that's one thing that really has been clear to me in the work that I've done with my mentors. And I try to pass on to my students and trainees.
Great. And then this is another question you don't necessarily have to answer if you don't want to, but if you do, can you recall an experience you've had that was really challenging or maybe made you question what you were doing, or any imposter syndrome sort of experience? And how did you overcome it? And what did you learn from it? Obviously you did.
Well, I'll start with the imposter syndrome part. We all experience that. And anyone who says they don't experience that, they're wrong. Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but it is something we all experience. You step into a new role, and it's not like you gradually step into it. You know, one day you're a graduate student, the next day you're a faculty member. It's not like you have 6 months in between, or maybe you're stepping into a postdoc and then stepping from a postdoc into a faculty position. It's completely natural to feel like, did I fool them? Do they really know me well enough? You know, and I certainly felt that way right out of the gate. My first teaching position, when I took this job at NCI, I was questioning it for probably a couple of years. Like, why did they hire me? Do they really think I could lead this huge, massive program? Do they really think I know enough to do that? You know, I mean, everybody feels some of that at some point in their career. The thing to do is to just wait it out and know that that other people feel that as well. As a social psychologist, I'm aware of the literature on pluralistic ignorance, the idea that, you know, we don't know what other people's attitudes are and we infer too much about their attitudes from their behavior. So there's the classic example of being in a classroom where everybody seems to know what's going on and you seem to be the only one confused. Well, it's probably the case that many other people are confused as well. And I think that happens here too. A lot of people experience that imposter syndrome and are unsure, but don't necessarily convey that because it's not appropriate, or maybe it's not even safe to convey that kind of lack of confidence. So wait it out and know that you're not alone. I think that's very important. Oh, and I don't know if I really answered your first question, which is, have I faced a challenge? And how did I do that? In a way, I've answered that because you were asking me about stepping into this administrative role. And I'd say that really was a challenge, moving from being an academic to moving into an administrative role, and just recognizing the differences that I had to pay attention to. But I'd say this is probably advice for junior scholars. Don't think of challenges as threats, but think of them as opportunities, right? And so that's the way I tried to view it. This is a great opportunity to be able to pass along what I've learned to others and to lead an area of science and multiple areas of science and be helpful to others in helping them get on their career trajectories. And that's really valuable to me. So I viewed stepping into these kinds of administrative roles as more of an opportunity to be grasped. And I knew I was going to make mistakes, and I have made mistakes. That's the nature of the beast. But as long as you keep trying, you end up having some successes as well.
Yeah, that's really reassuring. I remember when I first started grad school, one of the things another student mentioned to me that has kind of stuck with me forever is that, oh, you know, grad school is really just about impression management and making people think you're smart. And I don't know that. I mean, I think some of that's true. Like, you're trying to come off as competent, but then there's also kind of the struggle between being like an authentic person and being honest about what you're feeling. So I think
I agree. And by the way, I don't agree with that judgment of what graduate school is all about. I mean, yes, you don't want to come across as a nincompoop most of the time, right? Nobody wants that. But if it's all about impression management, then something's getting lost in translation, right? The point of being in graduate school is because you really enjoy science and really enjoy doing this. Well, it may be graduate school in a non-science as well, but whatever it is you're studying, you have a passion for it. And who decides to go to graduate school if they don't have passion, right? Because it's so much work, and you're not paid properly to do the work. You do it because it's intrinsically motivating. So I don't know if I would buy that judgment of what graduate school is all about, but I do understand the sentiment, which is that you don't want to come across as having a lack of confidence.
Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. Thank you. And so now I just have a few more questions about you going off of that. So what profession other than your own would you like to attempt if you weren't in this field?
Well, I'll tell you, when I went to college, I told you I was a math major and I didn't know where things were going to end up. But on my mind was the fact that I play the saxophone, and wouldn't it be cool to be a professional musician? And, the bottom line is that that's a very difficult occupation. There are some great musicians out there, and I tip my hat to them, but you have to have luck go the right way to make it in the music business. So if I could do that, I would love to be a professional musician, play saxophone in a bunch of bands. And I actually do play in a bunch of bands right now, but it's for fun. It's a hobby rather than being a profession. I don't have to worry about paying the utility bill from from making money on music gigs.
Yeah. Are you in any bands that play around?
Yeah.
DC?
Yeah. The one that's most active is a big band in the Montgomery County area. And we do all kinds of things, weddings and outdoor concerts, indoor concerts, festivals, all kinds of things.
You'll have to send us a link to your page, or if you have like a Facebook page or something, we can get
Oh,
the
sure.
word out.
Happy to do that.
Go into your shows.
Yeah, the band does have a webpage. It's theonlybigband.org, but I can send that to you.
Okay, sounds good. And other than that, are there any other little known interesting facts about yourself that people might be surprised to learn?
Well, let's see. People might be interested in knowing that my brother Eric is an executive producer of Chopped, which is a pretty well-known television show on the Food Network. And in fact, when I tell people about that, they don't want to talk to me anymore. They want to talk to my brother because he does something very cool. And yeah, it's fun watching his TV show. So that's one thing that's interesting. Another would be, I spent many summers of my childhood working in a camp as a counselor. And I think that's what got me started in teaching. I loved doing that so much that I became a professor, and have really loved teaching throughout my career. And I still teach a course now, actually, even though I'm at NIH. So it's a lot of fun. And in a couple of weeks, I'm going back to a reunion of all the other camp counselors I worked with back when I was a teenager. So that was 35, 40 years ago. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's great. So I think to end this, kind of a more general question regarding the future of decision science. I know this is kind of a big question, but what are the hopes that you have for the next generation of decision scientists, for the field, how it's going to grow and develop in the future? Have you thought about anything like that?
Well, I think decision science has been very successful at developing new models and applying those models and findings to a lot of different problems. But the world is changing, right? And I guess it's changing in two ways that would be very relevant. One is just the availability of data, big data, right? We keep hearing about big data, and some big data sources are just garbage. So you get garbage in and garbage out if you try to do research with those data. But some big data really are very useful. And I think in our graduate training, we probably need to do a better job of really helping students understand how to work with different kinds of data sets, because those data sets can often be used in very innovative ways to test important questions. Now, sometimes they need to be integrated with other data sets, looking at policy data, for example, and linking policy data with health outcomes, which often involve personal decisions. That's a very useful skill to have. And so I think that would be important in the future. So the analytical skills and technological skills, I think, and big data, all of that, having access to that and feeling comfortable with that is important. But then there's also what's going on in the world and the kinds of topics that decision scientists can study. And, it doesn't take a PhD to know what those topics are. COVID-19 has had such an effect on so many different aspects of the human experience, many of which involve decision making. And so clearly we can take what we know from the decision science literature and apply that to understanding how to do a better job of managing a pandemic like that. Our understanding of systemic racism can certainly be contributed to by research and decision science, because a lot of what happens in systemic contexts is the product of individual decision making done in an aggregated context. And so I think it's important for us to take what we know from decision science and use it to a good end and address some serious problems like systemic racism. And then a third thing that's happening in the world, which I think decision science can contribute to, is misinformation and the spread of misinformation and the impact of misinformation. We know a lot about how information affects decision making, but we know maybe a little less about how to offset the development and the dissemination of misinformation and what the impact of that can be. And decision scientists really have a lot to say about that. Decision scientists have introduced all the different kinds of biases that affect how we process information and use information. So let's take that and use it in a way that can reduce the spread of misinformation and correct misinformation, and also maybe even address some of the underlying reasons why misinformation gets generated and disseminated in the first place. So those are a couple thoughts.
Great, thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the SIG before we end and let you go?
Just, I think this special interest group is really important, and I'm glad that SBM has it. And I just tell people as much as I can, hang in there. This is a difficult time we're going through right now, but NIH still has a lot of funding, and there's still a lot of really great research going on. And graduate programs have not closed down. They've just gone virtual for some time. So we're all sweating it right now, trying to get through this, but hopefully we will come out the other side looking pretty good. And hey, they had the roaring 20s last time we had a pandemic, so maybe we'll see something like that again. And in science, that would be even better.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure, my pleasure.
And then I decided I wanted to switch to psychology. So I kind of had the opposite experience where I started
That's
grad
terrific.
school.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, in my first stats class, we were doing ANOVAs and stuff, which I had never really done. So I was like, oh no, like maybe I'm not in the right place. Maybe this isn't what I thought. And then in one of my classes, we were assigned a paper. I can't remember the full title now, but a paper that you wrote that was basically explaining the value of social psychology to public health. And I was like,
oh yeah, great.
Yeah, I was like, oh my God. And it made me, I mean, I didn't know who you were at that point, but it made me feel so much better because I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, I should have, this is good. I should have done this. So thank you for writing that paper.
Oh, sure. I'm so happy to hear that, Jackie, because when we wrote that paper, that is kind of what we had in mind. We really had two audiences in mind. One was social psychologists, just to show them that the work that they're doing really could have an impact on public health and could have more of an impact than maybe it had. And the other audience was people in public health who could see what the value of social psychology might be to help them achieve their goals. But I have to say, what I hear most from people who have read that paper is something along the lines of what you just said, which is, I didn't really feel like I had an identity. And now that paper helped me feel like the work that I do fits. It fits somewhere. And I have kind of an intellectual home. And you probably know there's a social personality health network that was started within the social personality SPSP. Social personalities. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of it now. It's so funny.
I know. I think it's Society
for Personality and Social Psychology.
Yeah.
I was messing up the first S. Anyway, so that group has had a pre-conference every year, and for like 10, 15 years now. And that's also a bit of a home for people who do research at this interface of social psychology and health. And I think it's really been a good place for people to go because they do feel like the work that they do fits somewhere. within the overall, under the umbrella of social psychology.
Yeah, I haven't been to that pre-conference yet, but I've been to SPSP. Maybe, I think this year I'm planning to go too, so maybe I'll sign up for that pre-conference this time.
Yeah, okay. It's a good one, and it's usually oversubscribed. They usually get more people than they can handle. And it's one of the biggest pre-conferences at SPSP.
Nice. Yeah, going to SPSP has been like interesting too, because it's so different from like APHA and these other like public health ones that I'd been to
Very
before.
different,
So
right.
It's very interesting.
Absolutely,
but I learned
right.
a lot. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're really busy.